Is the Biden administration in bed with TikTok and with Meta, that of course being Instagram and Facebook's parent company? And together, are they censoring Americans' access to pro-Palestinian content? It's well documented that Hamas, the organisation most recently responsible for the October 7th terrorist attack against Israel, has long been barred from online platforms. But what's less apparent is the government's ongoing pressure on these social media giants to police their networks. New reporting from investigative reporter Ken Klippenstein reveals that the federal government is influencing the companies to ban Hamas-linked accounts, and even those belonging to pro-Palestinian Americans who have no affiliation with the terrorist organisation.
Klippenstein's report, published last month, reveals a text buried in a readout presented at a May 15th meeting between the State Department and other international governments that the U.S., quote, updated the group on U.S. efforts to engage tech companies in voluntary collaboration to limit Hamas's use of online platforms, including social media, for terrorist purposes. Here with us now is author of the expose, independent journalist Ken Klippenstein. Welcome back, Ken.
Hey guys, great to be with you.
It's good to have you back. Now, you have done some original reporting here, picking up on some text that was otherwise not really picked up upon, which you think might create a inappropriately large opening for the U.S. to go after Hamas-linked accounts that are really just communications by people who are pro-Palestine, generally speaking?
Yeah, so what I found in that readout you mentioned, and in the readout was reference to a previous meeting on the part of the State Department's counterterrorism coordinator, in which they're working with social media companies to respond to sharing of this content. And what was incredible to me is that neither one of those references was ever reported. And so when we have, I've been reporting on the federal government's counter disinformation efforts for a couple of years now. And, when you talk about some of these other issues, as I've reported in the past, for example, Biden's withdrawal from Ukraine, COVID, people are happy to talk about, that gets a lot of play, particularly in the conservative press. But in this instance, I couldn't find any reporting on any of this. And this is a systemic problem. I cite in the story a very detailed report by Human Rights Watch, in which they describe a huge number, thousands of people's accounts and posts being taken down, including U.S. citizens, not just, when they say Hamas linked, that's not defined, but that's clearly being executed on the part of these social media companies in a way that's more expansive than just, formal affiliates of the terror organization.
And I actually wanted to get in on exactly the point you raised, Ken, because it doesn't even matter whether it's the conflict in Gaza or elsewhere. That phraseology of being linked to a subversive or militant or terrorist organization is so sort of elastic in its definition. Do we have any sense of how, I know you say it's not defined, but you clearly believe it is being used to censor broadly pro-Palestinian content, correct?
Yeah, and I'd encourage people to look at that Human Rights Watch report. Don't take my word for it. It's not my belief. It's what they've shown to be happening on a systemic basis, not one or two examples, far more than that.
All right, so do you have any evidence of the kind of censorship that has been contemplated or actually happened? Because I am thinking of, for example, some of the attacks on protesters, even outside of the context of this conflict. There's that the law that the Supreme Court declined to weigh in on, which would basically constructively criminalize organizing protests, because if anybody affiliated with the protest does anything criminal, then the organizer of the protest is held accountable. You can really see the silencing effect of these overly broad laws, and I'm wondering if we've seen anything in effect in the realm of the social media censorship.
So in that case, what's interesting about some of these companies like Meta, and I mentioned this in the story, and you can pull this up on their website. It's not secret. A lot of this stuff is sitting right out there. It's just that the press hasn't reported on it. They literally take their cues directly from the national security apparatus within the U.S. federal government in terms of what they call dangerous organizations. They're literally just going off of the State Department's list of terror organizations. I cite one example of a pro-Palestinian activist Sean King, who on Instagram had millions of followers, huge reach in terms of pro-Palestinian accounts, had his account taken down for what they call, it's not just being a member of these organizations, it's quote unquote praising them, which I thought the word you used before, the elasticity of these terms, I think that's a very good way to put it, because his praise, it's not a point I would have made, but the point that he made was that the role of the Houthis in blocking or impeding commerce along the Red Sea has the effect of putting pressure on Israel. I'm no fan of the Houthis as an organization, but that's, a point that can be made in debate and I think is reasonable to consider. And if you disagree with it, you can respond to it. Instead, Meta banned him permanently from the account. And what was interesting about it is that I go to look at the page. They said that, this was on our list of dangerous organizations because it's on the State Department terror watch list. The Biden administration delisted them at the time. So they weren't actually on the list of terror groups. So even on their narrow criteria by which they define these dangerous organizations, how they ban people, they're not actually updating that in any sort of fashion. It's just on this list forever. King, as he described to me, tried to appeal it and just got nowhere. And so this is bigger than just Hamas. I mean, you can go on their Meta's website and see a whole list of these quote unquote reference to dangerous organizations that, again, is just parroting whatever the U.S. State Department is saying.
There are so many interesting elements to your reporting into this case, Ken, but one of the things that I'm curious about is whether people really have any means to redress what is effectively censorship here, because you mentioned Sean King and he appealed and didn't really get anywhere. And it does seem to me interesting because I guess the cover for suppressing this content is saying, well, it's private companies, it's Meta or whomever making their decisions. But if, as you suggest, they're working in tandem with the national security apparatus, let's say, it's really government censorship with a kind of patina of private enterprise over the top. I mean, this is an infringement on First Amendment rights, is it not?
Yeah, I really want to stress to people, you can find this open source. I have sources, but you don't have to rely on my sources who I can't name because I don't want to get in trouble. You can go on Meta's policy page for these quote unquote dangerous organizations, which in itself, I know it's hacked to reference Orwell, but I don't know how else to describe these things. That's literally their term for it. And they are just copy pasting what the State Department tells them. And that was the entire impetus for this story, was looking at the State Department counterterror coordinator's public in the public readout saying that they are working with companies to respond to this. So none of this, you don't have to engage in conjecture about any of this. This has all been, publicly disclosed by this federal agency and by some of the social media companies that they're working with. They're relatively transparent about it because the media doesn't report on these things. It was rather astonishing to me that this was the first report that I could find making reference to any of this stuff, given the obvious public interest in what's going on right now.
I mean, thinking of public interest, I was just looking at something that Glenn Greenwald recently said, where he was very frustrated by, frankly, the hypocrisy, shall we say, of a lot of right-leaning people who are very interested, I think rightly so, in the Twitter files and concerned about the relationship between the government and the pressure they were putting behind the scenes that's now been made public by the Twitter files on social media companies to censor all different kinds of information, including around COVID-related issues. Now it does seem like there's perhaps less interest, significantly less interest, when it comes to these equally or maybe even more explosive stories about government censorship when it comes to the issue of Palestine. And I wonder what you make of that.
Yeah, it's very frustrating to me because when I had this story, I had so many conservatives replying on Twitter saying, where were you during the other disinformation stuff? And I'll tell you where I was. I've been cited in the congressional record for my reporting that's critical of the federal government's response to disinformation. I've broken stories about, for example, the Foreign Malign Influence Center, the elevation of this mission to the level of the Office of Director of National Intelligence, which oversees the entire intelligence community. So, I like to think that I have some credibility on this issue and that I've been very interested in it, beginning with the Biden administration. And so, this charge that I'm only interested in this because I'm have some view on the Israel-Palestine issue is not true. The reason I'm looking at this is because this is where the apparatus is being pointed at at this point in time. And again, the federal government is not being quiet about it. You have the Congress repeatedly pressuring these executive branch, these national security agencies to bring the hammer down on protesters, trying now in the Virginia Attorney General to make a case that some of these demonstrations, student demonstrations, in some way constitute support for a foreign terror organization, which is very concerning. It's something that should be publicly debated, but about which there's very little in the way of critical reporting at all. You have requests to the Treasury Department to look into the finances of these student groups to see if they're funded by Hamas. I mean, this is all completely aside from what the federal government ends up doing with those investigations. It seems very hard for me to not see this and think, okay, this is going to have a chilling effect on the speech for people that are going to look at this and say, gosh, do I want to get involved in this stuff? If the FBI, if the Treasury Department, if the State Department counterterror coordinator is responding to all these things as though it's some patsy for a foreign terror group.
And just how dangerous is all of this, Ken, given that there is not just this sort of encroachment on freedom of speech generally, but as you point out, it's not like there has been massive media coverage of this. So the chilling effect that you refer to is taking place without there really being a lot of pushback, at least it seems, from mainstream media on it. So presumably those encroachments would then expand unless there is accountability for them, right?
Yeah, I think we have a very dangerous situation here where after 9/11, the FBI, along with a lot of the rest of the intelligence community, was massively expanded in all sorts of ways. One way was to create what's called a campus liaison initiative, which, again, I encourage you to go to the FBI's website. None of this is theorizing. You can read about it yourself. Scarcely reported, but it's there. And under this campus liaison initiative, they have a dedicated FBI liaison officer in every single field office. I think there are 52 or 54 of them across the country that specifically works with colleges and universities. And the FBI director, in testimony to Congress, as well as the Biden White House, has repeatedly referenced the fact that they are responding to these protests. Now, the FBI, being a member of the intelligence community, is not going to advertise the way in which they are responding to it, but it's clear from those statements that there's something going on. And so I think all of that is very concerning, given the FBI's history and this huge push on the part, particularly of Republicans, but not just Republicans, to try to substantiate some sort of foreign financing of these groups. The significance of that is the predicate you need to be able to investigate and strip of the civil liberties protections that Americans have. If you can say, oh, they're actually acting on behalf of Hamas or acting on behalf of the Houthis or whoever, then you can really take the gloves off and apply a lot of these tools that you would ordinarily apply to, Al Qaeda or ISIS or some of these other groups. So all of this is extremely concerning. I'm just frankly shocked at how little reporting on the national security side there is about it all.
Well, Ken, we appreciate your reporting, and people can find more of it over at your terrific Substack. Thank you again for joining us today.
My pleasure, guys. Thank you.